mortgage-backed securities really took off in 2000. That same year marked the culmination of 30 years of deregulatory efforts on the part of Congress. Evoking none other than Abraham Lincoln, Senator Phil Gramm sounded the clarion call to end the era of unnecessary regulation over Wall Street.
Some say that growing federal surplus means Washington has more money to spend, but they've got it backwards. The surplus is not the government's money. The surplus is the people's money.
Al Gore had won the national popular vote by more than 500,000. But he lost the two most important votes, the one in the Electoral College and the one at the Supreme Court. Case closed.
Wait a second, is this a live picture? This is a live picture. We are seeing the second World Trade Tower Center. World Trade Center Tower number 1 has just collapsed, ladies and gentlemen. We see it live on picture.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack. And this afternoon, I have a message for the Iraqi people. You will not have to fear the rule of Saddam Hussein ever again.
But clearly there was a ideological policy here that started with those horrible Bush tax cuts, which basically screwed over the middle class in favor of the rich. It was a huge transfer of wealth from working people to wealthy people.
Mr. Speaker, there's been a lot of debate about what caused this deficit. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which consists of Democrats and Republicans, used Office of Management budget numbers, and this is their analysis. The OMB released new figures showing this year's budget deficit growing to $455 billion. What happened? The presidents blamed the war and the recession for the turnaround in the nation's fiscal fortunes, ignoring the role of tax cuts. The Congressional Budget Office, your CBO, data show, however, that the tax cuts enacted since 2001 will cost nearly 3 times as much over 2003 and 4 as the combined cost of fighting an occupation in Afghanistan, Iraq, the cost of reconstruction and relief after September 11th, increased expenditures for Homeland Security, and the cost of dealing with terrorism on a worldwide basis.
Yeah, that's a static analysis.
3 times as much. In looking at that, looking at the high cost of occupation in Iraq and the needs we have in this country, would not have been better to have smaller tax cuts in order to keep down the deficits and fulfill the obligations we have with terrorism, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth?
Well, you know, if you got a hot horse and he has to go out and do work for you, and you don't have a lot of oats, and you only feed him a half a pound of oats a day, he doesn't do very much work. To get that horse to work, you got to feed him enough, and the tax cuts have to be adequate enough so this economy will work.
It took 42 presidents 224 years to run up $1 trillion of U.S. debt held abroad. This president has more than doubled that amount in just 6 years. Last year, we borrowed 65% of all the money that was borrowed in the world by countries, 10 times as much as the next biggest borrower. That's why this debt is jumping so dramatically, and it just fundamentally threatens our long-term economic security. If we don't deal with this, our children and grandchildren are going to have a much different life than we have enjoyed. We'll be in such deep haunt to the rest of the world, we'll be dependent on the kindness of strangers, dependent on other countries continuing to loan us vast amounts of money.
If 15 or 20 years from now, 2 or 3% of the GDP is being paid abroad merely to service the debts or the ownership of assets that have been incurred because we're over-consuming, that will be politically unstable.
Here's one idea I have floated. I don't know whether it's certainly not the answer, but I think that in all trade treaties, we ought to require other countries to make their minimum wage half the median wage, so that as those countries prosper because of trade, that prosperity goes to a large number of people. We build up middle classes abroad.
Lou? Larry, Robert is talking about one of the great deficiencies, of the many deficiencies of the NAFTA treaty, and that is no protection for labor, no protection for environment, no side letters were agreed upon, and we're paying a great price, as are the citizens of Mexico to this day. A couple of answers, Robert Reich, in terms of outsourcing, in terms of 30 years of consecutive trade deficits. A couple of things. One, the first thing I do is insist that this country follow the same trade practices as our principal trading partners. That is, mutual, reciprocal trade as the foundation of any trade partnership. We would not be exercising this this madness called free trade, which is anything but free. We've run up $5 trillion in trade debt in the past 6 years, as you know. That's unsustainable. We're paying a terrible price for it. That's money that's not being invested in this economy, in our young men and women, and in our future. The second thing I would do is, if we're going to have free trade, let's have free trade. Let's be honest. We don't have free trade with China. We have a $202 billion trade deficit. It'll be much higher this year, but as of last year, $202 billion with China. We have business people and economists as well saying, well, you know, those lower prices are important for our consumers. Our inflation rate in this country is approaching 5%. Those Nike shoes that are built overseas, why do they cost $110 here? And who gets the money? We need to start asking questions. Corporate America was thriving with corporate tax rates above 50%. And suddenly there is the great myth that those tax rates are much too high at 35%. You know, corporate executives say, well, you know, you can't raise taxes on us, we'll just pass that through to the consumer. But when you say, well, raise your wages, they don't say, well, we'll just pass them through to the consumer. No, that will shut down the business. We've got to begin to be honest.
Robert, you have a point?
Well, Lou, I wish I could disagree with you to make this an interesting debate. I'll try. I mean, I think you're saying exactly what I have seen and observed and worried over and tried to reverse. I mean, the fact is that wages, and this is the most important part. The economy continues to grow, and in fact, we've had a lot of growth in the economy, but median wages are stuck in the mud.
That's right.
And for blue-collar workers, people who are hourly workers, 80% of our workforce is blue-collar. Their working wages adjusted for inflation are actually going downhill.
Just that, I mean, people in this country are working harder than ever before. They're seeing corporate profits are up, executive compensation's exploding, their productivity is up, and their wages are flat. And there's something intrinsically wrong with our economy, and it starts with respecting work and in governing that way.
Talking the middle class talk is good for getting reelected, Lou, but when it comes to walking the walk, there are very few in Washington that do.
Well, the Republicans clearly representing and advancing the interests of corporate America on every domestic issue without exception. The Democrats, with great shame because of the tradition of the party, doing absolutely nothing to forestall this assault, direct assault, war on our middle class.
That's correct.
Bill Tucker, thank you. The White House has launched a major offensive to build public support for its domestic wiretap program before congressional hearings begin next month.
The president about to present a very dire warning to the American people. He will suggest that unless the Congress approves a $700 billion bailout for Wall Street and approves it within a matter of only a few days, there are going to be ominous consequences for the entire U.S. economy and for millions of Americans. At stake, a loss of an enormous number of jobs, home ownership around the country, savings and retirement plans, and a deep recession. His aides insist this is the worst economic crisis facing the United States since the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s. That's why they call what we're about to hear from the president, and I'm quoting now, a national rescue plan rather than a bailout. He's invited the congressional leadership over to the White House tomorrow, Republicans and Democrats, including Senators John McCain and Barack Obama. They all have agreed to attend. But as we know, the president now facing an uphill challenge to convince the American public he knows what he's doing. Let's get ready to go over to the White House. Here's the president.
Good evening. This is an extraordinary period for America's economy. Over the past few weeks, many Americans have felt anxiety about their finances and their future. I understand their worry and their frustration. We've seen triple-digit swings in the stock market. Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse, and some have failed. As uncertainty has grown, many banks have restricted lending. Credit markets have frozen, and families and businesses have found it harder to borrow money. We are in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action. We boosted confidence in money market mutual funds and acted to prevent major investors from intentionally driving down stocks for their own personal gain. Most importantly, my administration is working with Congress to address the root cause behind much of the instability in our markets. Financial assets related to home mortgages have lost value during the housing decline, and the banks holding these assets have restricted credit. As a result, our entire economy is in danger. So I propose that the federal government reduce the risk posed by these troubled assets and supply urgently needed money so banks and other financial institutions can avoid collapse and resume lending. This rescue effort is not aimed at preserving any individual company or industry. It is aimed at preserving America's overall economy. It will help American consumers and businesses get credit to meet their daily needs and create jobs. And it will help send a signal to markets around the world that America's financial system is back on track. I know many Americans have questions tonight. How did we reach this point in our economy? How will the solution I propose work? And what does this mean for your financial future? These are good questions, and they deserve clear answers.
Every reason given, publicly at least, has turned out not to be true. My question is, why did you really want to go to war? From the moment you stepped into the White House, from your cabinet, former cabinet officers, intelligence people, and so forth. What was your real reason? You have said it wasn't oil, quest for oil. It hasn't been Israel or anything else. What was it?
Investigators at the Government Accountability Office, as well as lawmakers, warn the Defense Department is now so overrun with contractors, there is a growing risk taxpayers are getting ripped off because nobody really knows how much contractors are doing. At the Army's own contracting office, the GAO found 40% of the employees were contractors themselves, overseeing other contractors. Peter Singer has written extensively on military contracting.
We so far have hired contractors in any situation where they can do the job. We haven't stepped back and said, is this something they should be doing?
These are the top Pentagon contractors. Together, they do as much as $130 billion a year in business, and it doesn't include $47 billion the U.S. is spending to rebuild Iraq. Senator Joe Lieberman warned the government might not even know when the self-interests of contractors are pitted against the interests of the American taxpayer. In the last month alone, the GAO has had 3 separate reviews of conflicts of interest in the defense industry. In one report, the GAO found that in 15 of 21 Pentagon offices, contractors outnumbered federal employees and made up as much as 80% of the workforce. Analysts say military contractors are performing financial oversight of other contractors and often making the best decisions for themselves and not for taxpayers.
The concern is that we're locking ourselves into a cycle because of these issues of competitions, of unintended consequences, where we get wrapped up in this circle of can't win with them, can't go to war without them.
DoD officials say there's so much pressure to keep the government small, they have to rely on outside contractors. A retired Army major, for example, can make as much as $200,000 a year. As a contractor, a lot more than that Army major is going to be paid to remain on active duty, so a lot of military people don't mind becoming contractors these days. Barbara Starr, CNN, the Pentagon.
This nation's finances are a mess. Just last year, our government paid $38 billion to the wrong people, and $20 billion just disappeared. The Government Accountability Office can't certify the books of the Pentagon, Department of Homeland Security, the Energy Department, and NASA. So much money is lost or misspent. For 9 years now, the government has failed its annual audit.
If this happened in the private sector, we would call the government Enron. I mean, this is the same sort of accounting that Enron did.
The GAO says the Pentagon is the biggest culprit, losing track of billions. The Defense Department acknowledges its bookkeeping problems and says it is trying to fix them. But incredibly, waste is the smallest part of the problem. Not only is the government failing to keep track of your money, it's borrowing huge sums to spend money it doesn't have. Last year, we paid $327 billion in interest, on track to spend more in interest than to run the country.
The GAO warned in a report this week that the U.S. is losing control over sensitive technology in the $200 billion Joint Strike Fighter program, the Pentagon's largest aircraft project that's being developed with U.S. allies. But the Pentagon says to restructure just the Joint Strike Fighter program to favor American businesses would cost taxpayers an additional $4 billion.
$500 million extra dollars would have to be spent by Lockheed to implement just the reporting requirements on this program. And that's quite a burden, I think, to the American taxpayer.
Defense contractors also oppose the Buy America plan, arguing it risks alienating U.S. allies. According to the industry, it's a two-way street. If the U.S. stops buying military goods from other countries may stop buying from the U.S.
They buy massive amounts, $150 billion worth of military equipment that, by the way, we use their military equipment.
The war, it seems, continues, and humanitarian agencies are worried that with it will continue the suffering of Yemen's children. Nermal Bar, CNN, London.